Hello and welcome to the Irish Aesthete. Previously, I was talking about Ashford Castle in County Mayo at a time when it was still a private shooting lodge. Here is the castle today. For the past 80 years, it has been an hotel rather than a private residence. But in the late 19th century, the estate was owned by Arthur Edward Guinness. In 1880, created Lord Ardiluan of Ashford, his chosen title an indication of a particular fondness for this place. Every year, Lord Ardiluan would come here for a few weeks during the winter months with his wife, Lady Olivia Hedges-White, when they would entertain parties of house guests invited to enjoy a few days' shooting on the estate. As I've mentioned, Ashford was never a full-time home for the couple. They spent the greater part of their time elsewhere, not least in London, where they kept a residence at 11 Carlton House Terrace. But they also owned a large place on the outskirts of Dublin. On the periphery of the Phoenix Park, Farmley, the house which had once belonged to Lord Ardiluan's brother Edward Cecil Guinness, future Earl of Iver, is well known since it is today owned by the state. But it's likely that fewer people are familiar with another former Guinness property, St Anne's. This enormous building began life as a relatively modest early Georgian house called Thornhill, when it was owned by the Vernon family who lived close by in Clontarf Castle. In 1835, Benjamin Lee Guinness bought Thornhill and its surrounding land. The estate was thereafter increased until it covered more than 500 acres. Meanwhile, the old house was renamed St Anne's after an ancient well of the same name in the vicinity, and the building was somewhat enlarged. However, the photographs here are of St Anne's after it had been further embellished by Lord Ardiluan, who, from 1873, employed the architect James Franklin Fuller for this purpose. As can be seen, the eventual house had the appearance of a gargantuan Italianate palazzo, with vast double-height top-lit galleried hall and an equally substantial winter garden. This was only reached after passing through an enfilade of reception rooms. It has to be said that the contents of these were more a display of wealth than taste, but such was often the case in the late 19th century. Meanwhile, the gardens around St Anne's were similarly and expensively embellished, with extensive planting of specimen trees and the creation of a series of follies. Long walks lined with classical statuary and a great deal of clipped box were also features of St Anne's Gardens. Much of this was recorded by Lady Ardilaun, who throughout her life was an enthusiastic, if not especially talented, watercolourist. Like Ashford Castle, St Anne's often welcomed guests, and once again evidence of these visits was duly preserved in the Chatelaines' photograph albums. At least here they seem to have been having a marginally better time than they did at Ashford. And also, like the latter, royalty were known to call, as can be seen by signatures in the visitors' book, which show that on August the 22nd, 1897, the future George V and his wife Mary dropped by. Even by the time work was finished on St Anne's in the 1880s, the place had become something of an anachronism, out of scale and out of sympathy with the Ireland that was then emerging. And after Lord Ardiluan's death in 1915, his widow found herself rattling around this vast house on her own. A rather poignant account of the widowed Lady Ardilaun can be found in Catherine Everett's engrossing memoir Bricks and Flowers. Everett was a cousin of Lady Ardilaun, and she was invited to live in a secondary house on the St Anne's estate. But in the end, it all became too much for one elderly woman, and so Lady Ardilaun moved into a suite in Dublin's Shelbourne Hotel, where she spent the final years before her own death in 1925. The estate was then inherited by one of her husband's nephews, the Honourable Benjamin Plunkett, retired Bishop of Meath. However, unable to afford its upkeep, in 1939 Bishop Plunkett sold St Anne's and almost 450 acres of land to Dublin Corporation for £55,000. A spectacular auction of the house's contents then followed. There were so many lots that it took 2 weeks to go through them all. After which the enormous place stood empty, occasionally used by the local defence force until gutted by accidental fire in 1943. The ruins were demolished in 1968. By that time, 200 acres of the estate had been given over to local housing, and the rest of the land was turned into a public park. Today, just a handful of features survive here to remind us of how the Guinness property once looked, such as this Pompeian temple situated on one side of an ornamental lake. And at the entrance to the old walled gardens is a 4-storey brick clock tower believed to date from 1850. In addition to the clock made by James Booth of Dublin, the tower contains a bell inscribed with Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness's name and his family motto, Spes mea in Deo, my hope is in God. The former stable block has been converted by the local authority into an arts and crafts centre and tea rooms. The rest we must leave to our imaginations, aided by an album of photographs showing St Anne's in all its overblown glory. Thank you so much for watching The Irish Aesthete, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, stay safe, everybody. Goodbye.